My name is Fatemeh Fannizadeh. I'm a Swiss qualified lawyer, also Iranian originally. And I'm going to talk to you today about sanctions. So we heard a lot in the two previous talks about sanctions. Here I'm going to try to demystify it a little bit, explain what are sanctions from multiple perspectives. This is not legal advice, so although I am a lawyer, I'm not going to give legal advice here. If you have any specific questions, get your own advisor. So here, just to set the stage, there are some premises to this conversation. The first one is that we all here do not want to engage in or facilitate any form of criminal activity. And this is an important premise generally for the topic. We believe in privacy, inclusivity, and censorship resistance as core values of our space. And where sanctions are deemed to be legitimate, we want to help with its compliance. But are they actually legitimate or not, or to what extent? We're going to see that in the next slides. So what are economic sanctions? They are basically restrictions in commerce and finance imposed in a country or a group of individuals in order to safekeep either national security, peace and security globally, or international law. And sanctions can be imposed by any country, by the UN, or any other form of global organization like the European Union. And the main player in the sanction space is OFAC. So I'm sure all of you have heard of OFAC. It's the Office of Foreign Assets Control of the U.S. Department of the Treasury. So it's a U.S. Institution that imposes sanctions on key individuals or countries or terrorist organizations or criminal groups. And because of its very broad vision of who has to comply with these sanctions, it is kind of the main player, and everyone else in the world looks very closely on what OFAC says and tries to comply with it. OFAC as well enforces those sanctions, so goes after anyone that they deem are violating these sanctions. So here is a very broad structure of how sanctions operate in the U.S. First, either they target individuals. So we heard often of SDN lists. So these are lists of just key individuals who are under sanctions. And we also often see public keys of so basically crypto addresses that are on these lists and that we cannot basically have anything to do with. There are also global sanctions against countries, like for instance, North Korea or Iran, where it's very broad and basically trade with these countries are banned. Then we have to look, once we identify the sanctions that are applied, whether or not there are general licenses, so exemptions or exceptions to these sanctions. So if we want to conduct any form of activity, we then have to look whether we're allowed under these exemptions, and if they are not allowed, whether we can ask for any kind of specific licenses, so specific authorizations to conduct these activities. And finally, any violations are enforced through prosecution, fines, and even prison sentences. So here on this map, you can see in red countries with broad sanctions against them. So we obviously see Iran, North Korea, Russia lately after the Ukraine invasion, Cuba, and so on. The other colors, mainly yellow, orange, are basically places where key individuals are under sanctions. But what sanctions actually are, and in order to understand basically all of the other collateral effects of this regulation, we have to adopt a form of economic analysis of law or a game theoretical approach to what sanctions are, because they have a lot of other side effects that we have to keep in mind if you want to later address the sanctions in a very practical manner. So first of all, they are an ineffective tool for liberation. So oftentimes the narrative put forward is that sanctions are against any form of oppressive, for instance, government, like in Iran, who is violating human rights, who is a threat for the world because of, for instance, its so-called nuclear program. And then like there are sanctions that are there to basically get rid of these governments. But so far in history, there is no proof that sanctions have worked in terms of liberating people or getting rid of any form of regime. Global sanctions are an effective market manipulation tool. So basically, by deciding to exclude one main or big actor from the global market of like trade or import and export, for instance, of oil with the case of Iran, then there are like consequences within the market, for instance, in terms of oil prices. And here I found these numbers really interesting. It comes from a US pro-Israeli think tank called the Washington Institute. It dates from 2012, where it says that, so that was in the context of Iran and its nuclear program that Iran deems was peaceful, but then the rest of the world said that they were looking to get the nuclear bomb. And here this report says that if the US does not impose sanctions on Iran, its gross domestic product could fall by up to 360 billion in 3 years. This is enough at current growth rates to send the country into recession. So basically, by imposing sanctions and lowering at around, I think, 10% the price of oil within the world, then they make some form of benefits, or at least they avoid some form of basically loss. And here on this graph, you can also see how political decisions, legitimate or not, outside of Iran, and in this case, specific case in the US, have clear influences on the economy in Iran. So for instance, in 2015, there was a nuclear deal reached with Iran where sanctions were reduced. So right after 2015, we see a boom in the economy. There was a lot of positive sentiment, a lot of foreign investment coming to Iran, and then Trump later unilaterally decides, without any form of justification, to exit from this deal, and then everything from that point onwards goes downhill, and the economy suffers from a lot. We heard before about hyperinflation and so on. Global sanctions are as well more human rights violations, because they add all of this hardship on the economy, and they forbid any form of import of technology, or also for medicine. In the case of Iran, a lot of people there do not have proper access to healthcare. The environment is also suffering because of the lack of technology to have just cleaner air, for instance. And this basically reinforces the human rights violations that are already happening. This is a quote from a United Nations report that says that US sanctions violate human rights, and it goes also against the position of the United States on these specific human rights and environmental issues. Sanctions violations are also a source of direct revenue for the US, and this is often not really talked about. But because one of the consequences of sanctions violation or prosecution for sanctions violation that may lead to a plea deal is very high fines. So here I put the example of UniCredit, which is an Italian bank that was fined over 1.3 billion for violating Iranian sanctions. And this money then gets distributed within different organs of the US public sector. This is one example. There are I think 20 more in the traditional financial sector. There are more examples in crypto. So in 2022, Bittrex was fined 25 million, around 24 million, for basically having Iranian use the exchange. Kraken was also fined 360,000 for possibly violating Iran sanctions. And what is interesting in the Kraken case is that basically OFAC reproached, and that's the highlighted part, reproached Kraken not to use geo-blocking of IP addresses from Iran. So Kraken had geo-blocking enabled for creating an account on the platform, but then it didn't have geo-blocking for using said account. So if someone had already an account and was in Iran, they could just log into Kraken, and that's why OFAC said that they basically facilitated sanctions violation, which is kind of ridiculous because you just need a VPN to circumvent this geo-blocking, which everyone uses. At least in Iran, it's kind of a by default thing on any device connected to the internet. And sanctions are also there to exert worldwide control by the US. So as we saw, OFAC has this very broad reach, and a lot of people fall under the jurisdiction of OFAC. So all of you here, no matter if you're here on a tourist visa, you are deemed US persons under sanctions regulation in the US, so you must comply while you're here with US sanctions. But also, if you're not here, but you have any form of ties to the US or your business has ties to the US, you are likely to fall under these regulations. So it's very broad reach. And the harsh enforcement that it exercises also leads to this control. And here I'm going to talk a bit about North Korea and how powerful it is in the context of crypto and sanctions, and how basically harmful North Korea was for all of us present here who are using the technology. So it all started with Virgil being arrested because traveling to North Korea and participating in a blockchain conference. It went on with the US Treasury sanctioning Blender.io because North Korea used it to launder I think around 20 million that it got from the Axie Infinity hack. And then a few months later, Tornado Cash was also sanctioned, and Alexei put into jail in the Netherlands for working on Tornado Cash. And this is just the beginning. I saw that a few days ago, North Korean hackers stole a record of 1.7 billion of crypto last year. And basically, given what was happening already so far, and I explained in the previous slides, it's like North Korea has the power to basically choose whichever platform it wants to send the money to launder its money, or just try to somehow use its ill-gotten funds, and then OFAC will target this platform and disable it from all of the other peaceful users. But we have some path forward that we could definitely use, and the first thing would be to understand our obligations and assess the risks that we're exposed to. So once we have this knowledge, then we do not act from a place of fear, and we can basically still conduct our projects the way we want by being compliant. We should also understand the policy objectives of the rules. So, for instance, like by putting Tornado Cash under sanction, what is the policy objective behind it? Can we reach the same policy objectives in some other way? We should then provide these technical solutions that we're able to build to meet this policy purpose, and also open a dialogue with OFAC and other institutions, because right now our relationship is quite hostile in some way, but OFAC does answer questions and is open to sometimes to this dialogue, and we should use this opportunity and basically work together. Here's just one example of a knowledge-based approach, and this is in the context of OFAC issuing the Iran General License D2 to increase support for internet freedom a few months ago. And after that, Elon Musk was able to send a few Starlinks to Iran to counter the internet shutdowns by the government. Another example that Amin spoke about before was Iran Unchained, and here you can find on the Medium this article about the sanction regime with regards to Iran and how they structure the project in order to be compliant but still to conduct its purpose. And the last example, which is basically about the next talk, is how by building this compliant tech, we can engage in a conversation with the regulators while also safekeeping everyone's interest in privacy. Thank you.